Okay, so hello and welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about mail trains, which were the prime mode of transporting mail after we stopped using horses and stagecoaches and before we used planes and trucks. So before the interstate highway system, trains were the primary and preferred mode of transporting mail. It was carried on a network of mail trains and on most regular passenger trains. Mail had a long history of being carried by trains in this country, a history that stretches back from 1838 to 1971. Mail was a hot commodity for the railroads, and the revenue that the railroads got from mail contracts actually did pay for a good chunk of the operating costs of trains. So when people try to say that the federal government or no part of the federal government subsidized passenger trains, the post office really kept a lot of passenger trains going through the mail contracts, and the loss of these contracts led to the decline of passenger trains, and also so did the railways, but that's a, again, different subject for the last few videos. For example, at the height of passenger travel in the United States, 20,000 trains ran daily, half of which carried mail. This included some 4,000 dedicated railway post offices staffed by over 20,000 clerks that covered over 216,000 miles of track across the United States. Also, I will note that there were approximately 4,000 RPOs at one point, but 10,000 trains carried mail. Some trains did carry mail but didn't have a designated car for it. Mail would be loaded into a baggage car and dropped off en route. And it was sometimes if it was running a motor coach, which hopefully I'll remember to throw picture of an RDC in here. The mail would be kept in the baggage section or its own special section of the baggage section if it didn't have a dedicated mail train, because not all mail trains sorted mail en route. A railway post office was for the sorting of mail that was either loaded onto the train where it started or was picked up and sorted en route versus just being having sacks of mail loaded onto the baggage car and just it being dropped off as baggage en route as the train stopped. So the first experiment with carrying mail came in 1832 when mail was carried between Lancaster and Westchester, Pennsylvania. This was a first attempt, but it wasn't seen as the first official mail train, which the first official mail trains came into existence between 1838 and 1840. The post office started carrying mail in what is the Northeast Corridor today, with trains running between Washington and Philadelphia and Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts. But the first official service with a railway post office car, which is hopefully the picture I've now thrown up on screen, which is at least a heavyweight one, came in 1864 between Hannibal and St. Joseph, Missouri. In 1838, Congress passed an act declaring railways as post roads for the sake of carrying mail. This replicated the British system of having dedicated roads to carry mail on. So what was it like working in a railway post office? Working in a railway post office, or RPO, was a busy and grueling English. The trains not only carried mail, but mail was also sorted while the train was running, which it would pick up and sometimes have delivered, and they'd pick it up and deliver it on the fly. So to back up a little bit before we get into the mail crane, mail was put into three different categories, which was closed pouch, which was mail that was loaded onto the train, pre-sorted at its terminal point where it began, and it would just be delivered as the train made its normal stops. Initial terminal, which was unsorted mail loaded into the train at its initial terminal, and it would be sorted en route. And between terminal, which was mail that was picked up over the route and it was sorted en route and sometimes delivered as well. Since mail was sorted en route, there had to be a place to put all the mail, and hopefully this isn't a horrible picture. If not, I will have more to throw in as time goes on. But all these little bags and slots around this car would be where they would stick the mail as they were sorting it. A certain town would be a certain box. The letters would be put into that slot. And since they were not labeled by town, since mail trains could travel thousands of miles all the way from Oakland to Chicago, what slot was associated with what town would change over time. So you actually had to remember this slot is for this town, this slot is for this town, and this slot will be for a different town after you go so far down the line. So not only did you have to have a really good memory, but you had to have a memory so good that you never screwed up, which is actually still a very big requirement of the post office today, is that you're able to remember all these systems without messing up. I think literally when I took the postal test personally, I think you have to get a 90%. I think it's 93%, I think was the cutoff or something ridiculously high like that to be a clerk on the post office even to this day. So this is a very demanding job. Okay, so as I mentioned, not every passenger train, but at least half of them at one point carried mail in some regard. Some would just have one mail car thrown onto the train, and then there were full-on units, not unit trains, but full-on mail trains, or it would be nothing but mail cars and a couple coaches on the end, because these trains were required to carry paying passengers along with the mail. It was part of the law that created them. They were also a passenger service, not just a mail service. So anyways, your dedicated mail trains would tend to make more stops than your first class trains like the Coast Daylight, but mail trains also didn't make every stop. So to handle Mail for stations where trains wouldn't stop the post office came up with a way to pick up and drop off mail at these stations. What was invented was the mail crane, as seen right here, which is this F-shaped piece of metal, and then the mail bag is hanging off of it. As the train passed by, the clerks on the train would extend the arm or net, which would catch the bag, and then the bag would be pulled in and they would start sorting it so they can start delivering it for the next stations. Mail for the station that they were picking up from, the bags would basically just be kicked out while the train was at speed, which could lead to some bad and or funny outcomes. Sometimes the bag wouldn't get kicked far enough and the bag would get stuck on the underside of the train and break open, which would be called a snowstorm, and would end up with the clerk getting 5 demerit points for doing that. And also the station agents would have to go and look along the line to pick up all the mail, which was sometimes in the middle of the night. Other things that would happen would be, which was known to happen, was that the clerks would kick the bag so hard that their shoes would come off and get stuck, outside the train. And on at least one occasion, a mail bag actually flew through a station window and scared the crap out of whoever was in there. So that was fun things like that. And also, just as a quick aside, this picture that I'm hopefully putting up, I think is the Lark. If I remember my SP train numbers, I think 76 and 77 were the Lark. This is in San Francisco, I can tell because of the commuter coaches over here on the right-hand side of the picture. The first car on the train is the mail car, and they're loading mail into it to be dropped off while the Lark was going en route to Los Angeles, or down the line to Los Angeles. I keep saying en route, whatever. But anyways, the mail would be loaded on, usually on night trains like this, and loaded and unloaded. And a little note of history, which I think I talked about in the Lark Coastline video, is that this train actually got eliminated, I think, within a couple months after its mail contract was lost. So a lot of these trains were only kept alive by the mail contract. Like, what passengers they carried were secondary at best. At least if you were paying for like a bedroom, but if you were paying for a seat, you were just kind of there to fill up space and get a little bit of extra money off of. But like with all train service in the United States, they went into decline as well, starting in the 1950s. In 1958, Congress passed, I think it was just called the Transportation Act of 1958 or something. I don't remember the exact name. Anyways, it was a law that allowed railways to more easily drop money-losing routes. The slow decline pushed the post office to start using trucks and vans to transport more mail, and when jet airliners became more common in the late 50s, mail started going by air a lot more frequently than it used to. As I said, for comparison, in 1929, 10,000 trains carried mail. By 1965, that number had dropped to 190. This decline and increasing costs of the mail trains caused the post office to introduce Mr. Zip and the Zone Improvement Plan. The core of this plan was the transition to the mechanical sorting of mail, which my parents actually worked on those machines that replaced the mail trains, ironically enough. And one grandparent actually worked for the railroad. But anyways, this mechanical sorting would require us to add something to the address. This would be a numeric code that the machines could read and use to sort the mail by destination. What I'm describing is the zip codes we all put on mail. The Zone Improvement Plan zip was the way the post office was able to get rid of the last of the mail trains, or at least most of them. So in 1967, the post office announced that it would be eliminating most of the existing mail trains, or at least the ones that were remaining, because the Zone Improvement Plan had gotten to the point where all the mail was just pre-sorted anyways, or at least most of it was. And by 1968, of the 190 mail-carrying passenger trains that were still running, that number was reduced to 8. Not 800, not 80. By 1971, when Amtrak rated 7 of those remaining 8 were eliminated as well. And the only remaining mail train was a Conrail train that traveled between New York and Washington, D.C. on the Northeast Corridor. And this train ran until the late 1970s when it too was eliminated. And I believe it ran overnight, and I don't think it carried passengers because at that point Amtrak was the only way to do it. But why were these trains eliminated in favor of using machines to sort mail and for the mail to be hauled on trucks and planes? The reason was that the RPO contracts were fairly expensive for the post office, as I mentioned earlier. When I was at the Sacramento Railroad Museum, a volunteer who actually worked in a mail car when he was in his early days with the post office in the 60s, he was telling this story about how he worked on it and a little bit about what was going on. And according to him, the post office paid 55 cents per mile a mail car traveled on top of the wages the clerks got on the trains. So this meant that an 18-car solid mail train would cost the post office $9.90 per mile to run on top of the wages of up to 7 clerks per car. So for comparison, $9.90 in 1960s money would be nearly $88 today. So for a mail train to be running at like an 18-car length along the California Zephyr as a route. This is the back of the napkin math I did for this. The post office would be paying $214,000 to run one train one way along the route of the current California Zephyr, which is over 2,000 miles, which would be an annual cost of $162.8 million to run this mail route over the modern route of the California Zephyr, which would require the sending of over 296.1 million first-class letters for the train to even break even. And I didn't look up exactly how much the post office mails per year, but mail is declining, and most mail nowadays is not first class mail. So you would need a lot more than that to make it worth it, or at least a lot more packages. So yeah, that's one of the main reasons why mail started declining. It's easier to have like 10 dudes working in a post office who can do like half of a state's mail processing in one night versus sending it on a train with God knows how many people sorting the mail by hand. You'd also avoid the cost of paying to run the trains, which was expensive, as you can see. I mean, $162.8 million expensive. I mean, what is that, like 3% of Amtrak's annual budget? Or at least, yeah, I think it is about like, 2 or 3% of Amtrak's current budget would just be a mail train if the post office still carried mail by train mostly. So yeah, it was really expensive, and it was kind of one of those things that was going to come to an end eventually. So after the mail contracts were ended, the railways were left with a large number of now surplus mail cars, which as we can see here, these are the older ones. One thing that happened to them was a lot of them were just scrapped since the railways didn't bother to modernize a lot of their equipment, just like with their regular trains. So some of the newer mail cars, or the older mail cars, would just be scrapped or sold off, either to museums or short lines or heritage railways or scrappers. But some of the newer ones actually ran as baggage cars, since the mail cars are newer than some of the existing baggage cars. And some of them actually ran on Amtrak until 2018, and they were the heritage fleet. And the last of the mail cars were built for the Union Pacific in 1963. But that actually doesn't mean that trains don't carry mail anymore. It's actually not uncommon for like UPS, FedEx, and other shippers, and I think even including in that the post office, to have their trucks loaded onto the backs of trains and then have the trains just pull the mail across the country because it's cheaper than paying for the truck, which is ironic, I guess, in a way, is that freight is cheaper rail wise than truck wise, but mail trains are just not a thing anymore. I guess in a way they are, but they're freight instead of passenger services now. So mail still is carried by trains, but not one we could ride. But I don't know. It's one of those things like normally I'd be like, oh yeah, it's kind of a bad thing that we did this, but at the same time, it's like we went from having trains go from like, yeah, it's a private public service to it's just a public service run by a quasi-government entity. So, as bad as Amtrak is, Amtrak existing is better for the railroad industry in this country than it is to not exist. So, I don't know, you win some, you lose some. I mean, we lost a lot of trains when Amtrak came into existence, as mentioned in one of the previous couple videos. But at the same time, it's like Amtrak is kind of better in a lot of ways than leaving it in the hands of the private companies who, frankly, probably would have all gone out of business hard by like 1975 if it weren't for Amtrak. So again, you win some, you lose some. And I'm going to leave it there, and this is probably going to be a fairly short one. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully you do come back for the next one. I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to be doing for the next one, so we'll see where we go. And anyways, hope you leave your comments, your concerns, your dislikes, your anger, or whatever in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.